on to our fabulous speaker. So Professor Levenson, and I think so many of us know, he holds the Schusterman Josie Chair in Judaic History and has written extensively on the Jewish experience for both scholarly and popular audiences. His book, Between Philo-Semitism and Anti-Semitism, was nominated for a National Jewish Book Award Prize. His textbook, Modern Jewish Thinkers, is now in its second edition, and it's widely used in classes on Jewish thought. He's won a number of prestigious fellowships, including an ACLS, and has lectured in the United States, Israel, and Germany. And so arriving at 2009, he has completed several major projects, including making the Modern Jewish Bible for 2011, the history of Bible translations and commentaries in the modern era. He worked as the general editor of the History of Jews and Judaism, which came out in 2012, and he wrote JuSt, Portraits Through the Ages from 2016. He recently published Maurice Samuel, Life and Letters of a Secular Jewish Contrarian, the History of Jews and Judaism, Facts and Fictions, and giving the dates specifically so you can see, and putting us all to shame about how quickly these books are coming out right now. He received his BA and MA from the Brown University, magna cum laude, and his PhD from Ohio State University. His first professional commitment remains teaching undergraduate and graduate students to write, speak, and read more effectively. And I'm going to add to the introduction that he gave something that I said last year when Alan said at the Rosh Hashanah reception, when Alan stepped down from being director and I came in instead. So Alan served for 9 years as the second director of the Schusterman Center. And we were all so lucky to have Alan at the helm. So some of you have heard this already, I apologize. He is an incredibly prolific scholar, as you see. In his time as director, he's published several books, as well as articles, essays, and op-eds. And you can pay attention in the Norman transcript. He appears very often, sort of giving Brian Walters a very hard it's always very fun to read, but it's incredibly sort of from a position of tremendous knowledge. On the Bible, Zionism, Jewish intellectual history, anti-Semitism, and philo-Semitism. He's a celebrated and beloved teacher and colleague, which is most aptly recognized in having been named an OU Regents Professor, I think it was last spring. As director, Alan brought his brilliance as well as some New York realness and Hamishness to Oklahoma, and he can always be counted on to fight for and empower the people around him. We're grateful to him for all he's done for the center, and we look forward to his talk today. So please join me in welcoming Professor.
Yesterday, I started to set up for my class and realized I hadn't brought them. I made a mad dash through the rain. I don't go anywhere though. Thank you very much. It's great. Great to see colleagues, students and community, just as Rona said, all together. I will try to keep this to about half an hour, 40 minutes, so that there'll be plenty of time for questions. I hope I get to the pilot sample of the new Reform Torah commentary, which I'm involved with. I'll talk about that a little bit. But if not, you'll find it pretty interesting to compare the 1981 and the yet to be published new Torah commentary. So thank you, everybody. There were two prompts that maybe say, hey, Rona, I'd like to talk about this year. One negative, one positive. The negative, Rona already mentioned, Ryan Walters' proposal to mandate Bible teaching in Oklahoma public schools. I'm obviously very much in favor of biblical literacy. But aside, well, I'll just say three quick problems with it. Constitutionally, it probably violates the Establishment of Religious Clause of the First Amendment. So far, that's been the opinion even of the Oklahoma Supreme Court. If it goes further, we'll see. Pedagogically, our teachers in our public schools have not been trained to teach Bible, and they are not currently being trained in colleges of education. So you're asking people to teach an extremely difficult subject with no preparation. I would say pedagogically, that's pretty bad. And the default undoubtedly will be for teachers to repeat what they heard in Sunday school. Or what else could they do? Or repeat things that they remember vaguely from their pastor. I think this is really no way to go about public education. By the way, people think Oklahoma isn't religiously diverse, but that's quite wrong. It's extremely religiously diverse, and I'm not talking about Jews. There are few enough of us. And I'm not even talking about Catholics, and that's a pretty fewer, but still the minority. But I'm talking about within Protestantism itself. If you Google it, you'll get some absurd number for the number of Protestant denominations in the United States. But even if that number is not so relevant, it's certainly relevant if you are let's say, an evangelical. It would be, I think, pretty problematic to have a liberal Protestant telling you about J, E, P, and D and the four sources that go into the Torah, and vice versa. So, and finally, I'll just say this about this negative prompt, and that is because I teach sometimes a capstone course called The Bible Since the Enlightenment. The fact is, Oklahoma has a very good Bible teaching law on the books from 2010. It's an elective course. It's to be taught as literature and history, and it's to be taught as social studies in high school. It's actually quite a well-drafted law. And the thing about it that I like the most, and which is most relevant to today's talk, is it does not mandate a particular translation. And in the next half hour, if I can't convince you that is wise, I really have failed here. The other prompt is a positive one, and that is I've been involved in the Reform Movement's new Torah commentary. It's still underway. The pilot, what you have in front of you on the tables, is a pilot page from the last weekly portion of Exodus, and the Torah commentary has not been updated since 1981, when Wolf Gunter Plaut published, along with some help, his Reform Torah commentary. And you can tell from the name, quite a lot about Plaut's book. So we will come back to that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk briefly. I'm going to unpack my subtitle, Modern Jewish Bible Translation. Then I'm going to give you some fun examples. Well, good is easy because most Bible translations are actually quite good. But then I have to treat you to a couple of really bad. And I think you'll agree with me. And then, time permitting, we'll actually get to look at this handout. But if we don't, that's okay. Okay, just very quickly, I'm going to show you a few things all in Hebrew just to make a point. I don't expect you to read all of this, Dan. We run. Well, this is a Trojan horse of a Bible. This is Moses Mendelssohn's Bible. It's considered the first modern Jewish Bible by a lot of people. There were others, just like there were other German translations around Martin Luther's and other English translations preceding the King James Bible of 1611. They aren't really the first, but they're often referred to that way. And I say this is a Trojan horse Bible because to look at it, it of course looks like a traditional rabbinic Bible. And it's all in Hebrew characters, and you have the broken up text. Here you do have the traditional Hebrew text. And here you have Rashi, the most commonly reproduced medieval commentator. But here, instead of the Aramaic translation, which actually does show up here, you have Mendelssohn's translation into German. And if you say that doesn't look German to me, that's because he thought it would just be too discombobulating to have Roman characters on a Bible. But that's German. It's not Yiddish. It's not Judeo-German. That's good German. He was a wonderful German stylist. And down here, we have Mendelssohn's own commentary, which mainly focuses on what we would call the literary elegance of the Hebrew Bible. If you want to know somebody who's not a lot like Mendelssohn, but in the modern era, Robert Alter, right? Who I think this is the single. I'm going to just pass these around. I have a few handouts. I think this is the single best Bible translation, but there are a lot of good ones. Okay, let me unpack what I mean by modern Jewish Bible translation. I won't belabor these points, but I think they're kind of important. Well, I know that a lot of people will date modernity from the advent of Taylor Swift. But I think when you're talking as a historian, it goes back a little bit further than that. If you're interested in the Bible, I would say the Protestant Reformation, beginning of vernacular Bibles, and the printing press are not a bad place to start modernity. Certainly, we have Luther and we have the King James, and someone still needs to write good book about why these two are so different. To use terms I'll use later in the talk, Luther is very, very focused on what's called the target language. In other words, German. Luther was committed to having everybody who read German be able to pick up a Bible and read it for themselves and come to some religious conclusions. And Luther this is what we call in translation language, which I'll get back to, very target oriented. And very populist, you might say. The King James Bible one could talk about it endlessly. It is not a populist Bible. It is not a Bible for the hoi polloi. Use good Hebrew. It is a Bible that was meant to be read from the pulpit. It's large, it's expensive, it's excessively punctuated, and it was meant to be read to essentially a placid audience. So it's not quite as it's very focused on the source language. In other words, King James tries as best as it can, given the great differences between English and Hebrew, to actually keep the cadence of the original Hebrew. And we'll see a couple of examples of that, even including a couple of King James features that because people have told you about it, like the ands. All of those ands in the original 1611 King James Bible. That's because so many of these Hebrew verbs start off with that vav. That single letter vav, and the King James translators, the companies of translators, decided to maintain that. They also marked with italics, which we use for different purposes nowadays, but they used it for basically present tense to be verbs, which are implied in Hebrew, but not written out. So I am, the am in the King James, you'll see it in italics. So the King James Bible, which I actually quite love, is really attempts to be very much adherent to the Hebrew syntax and Hebrew word order, and quite a lot of the repetitions that are important in Hebrew, they also do try to repeat. Okay. That's almost, you can read for yourself, so I'm not going to go through this. Everybody kind of agrees in Jewish historiography that Jewish modernity is a little bit belated. The rest of, and it's also, this is a very European concept of modernity. I'm aware of that. Basically, though, if you're looking at it from the point of view of intellectual history, Mendelssohn and the Mendelssohn Bible Project is not a bad place to start Jewish modernity, 1760s, 1770s. And Mendelssohn, what he accomplished was extremely significant in terms of bibliocentrism. The modern era, in some ways, is the golden age of the Bible in Jewish culture. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, and I suppose it is, but as Jonathan Sheehan, great scholar out in Berkeley, has really argued to the nth degree. One of the things that happened to the Bible as soon as it became widely available, I'll pass it around, Carol, widely available and people could read it for themselves, is all of a sudden the Bible, which was theologically challenged, became historically, philologically, aesthetically, and in other ways became an important cultural text as well as a theological one. And Mendelssohn Sheehan discusses him briefly. Mendelssohn wanted very much to make the Bible, rather than rabbinic literature, the core identifier of Jewish values and Jewish aesthetics. And rather famously, Mendelssohn championed good Hebrew. He was a great champion of proper Hebrew and good Hebrew grammar. And he considered, and actually we've all been following Mendelssohn as Jews ever since, for at least for the mainstream, thought that the Bible is a much more profitable and congenial meeting ground for Jews and Christians than, say, Talmudic literature. Okay, I could go on that, but I won't. I could go on all this, but I won't. Well, okay, well, let me just, I know it's kind of obvious, but I think it needs saying. Okay, modern Jewish Bible translation, Jewish. How can a translation be anything like Jewish, Christian, Muslim, what have you? It doesn't seem to make sense. But what really, when we say that, what we mean is there are certain features of Jewish translations of the Bible that you come to expect, and therefore they become culturally, that's what signifies a Jewish translation. And I just borrowed this from Leonard Greenspoon, who just passed away a few months ago. His wonderful book on history of Jewish Bible translation. Jewish Bible translators know Hebrew. That may sound, well, shouldn't anybody who translates the Bible from the Hebrew Bible know Hebrew? Yes, they should. And should anyone who translates the New Testament or Greek scriptures know Greek? Yes, they should. Let me just say they don't. So that's one feature. It follows Tanakh, in other words, Torah, prophets, and writings. I'll come back to that term next slide. Jewish Bible translations tend to remind readers they are translations. For a synagogue Bible, that's done very obviously by putting the Hebrew text in your synagogue Bible, but it's also done in the notes, saying in Hebrew, this is X, Y, or Z, very consistently. Jewish Bible translations rely on the Masoretic text heavily, even when they don't. I'll explain that in a second. So the Masoretes were a group of people in the 9th and 10th centuries who made sure that the Hebrew text was more or less standardized. It's a more complicated than that, but let's leave it at that. It's a bit ironic because, of course, even though, say, the New Jewish Publication Society, which is still probably the most widely used translation at the moment, it says on the spine of the book, according to the Masoretic text, but let me tell you, as soon as you begin to see every place where the Greek version of the Septuagint or a Dead Sea Scroll text or some ancient Akkadian or Ugaritic cognate has clarified the text, I guarantee you those Jewish Publication Society authors followed what they knew to be the closest thing to what the biblical text ought to be. So it says Masoretic text on the spine. I'll say there's an additional irony here. This is really getting pretty obscure, I guess. But the Masoretes themselves were largely Karaites. In other words, they themselves were not exactly rabbinite Jews. They were kind of slightly heretical group. Okay. That's just curiosity. These last 2 points, I'm not sure if Greenspoon is right, but they're his points, so I thought I want to put them down there. The means of cultural integration, I really would challenge a little bit. I think that's true of Mendelssohn. I think it's been true generally, but there are a couple of pretty interesting exceptions. I'm going to pass this one around. This is a Hebrew translation, and it's not the only one either. This was done in Israel a couple of decades ago when Israeli high school students complaining bitterly about the exams they had to take in Bible said, we can't understand this text anymore. It's ancient and antiquated language. And Avraham Avuya said, okay, I'm going to translate it from biblical Hebrew to modern Hebrew. And people were really angry. The other couple of examples here that are worth noting in passing is we have a very famous translation by the Hebrew Yiddish poet Yehoash from Hebrew to Yiddish. It's pretty hard to call that a means of cultural integration into Yiddish. Okay, I don't think so, but we'll just grant Greenspoon his point here. Okay, the word Bible. You would say, how could you possibly think that needs explanation? The word Bible, but it really does, because it's not at all obvious that in Jewish culture through the ages there was a Bible. What is certainly true is that there were the 5 books of Torah, which get read every year and then get read again every year ad infinitum. But you know what? The Torah is not even 1/2 of the whole content of the Hebrew Bible. And prophets, generally speaking, get stapled onto those Torah portions, the weekly Torah portions. And if they don't get stapled on, they often don't get read. And you don't have a sense of the book of Jeremiah when you read 2 chapters of it. I can tell you from personal experience, you just don't have a sense of it. Psalms, plenty of Psalms in the prayer book, but once again, the idea of a book of Psalms, 150 of them, not really. The only real exception I can think of to this is the 5 holiday scrolls, which you do read end to end. But otherwise, it's really quite dubious whether Judaism had a Bible. And people have written about this, a lot about this, and most of it's over my head, frankly. But I will say that from the point of view of Fred Greenspan, a very, very fine Bible scholar who taught at Denver, Florida Atlantic, now he's back to Denver. In his view, you don't really have the concept of a Jewish Bible until the last 200 or 300 years, when you have this term Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im and Ketuvim, Torah, prophets, and writings, essentially edging out other language for the Hebrew Bible. At that point, Greenspan says, then you really have something akin to what the West has had for a while, the idea of one book, which is still more than one, it's still an acronym. Okay, so finally translation, and then I'll be done unpacking my subtitle. And then we'll go to my timer. This is actually, we're good. Okay, of all of the terms, this is, I think, the one where people in the academy and ordinary folks have our furthest apart in their understanding of like what translation is. And there are a lot of people in this room who've done translations, right? I can see from faces, and you mean whether you've done written translation, if many of us in the academy have, or you've done oral, like if you grew up speaking Spanish, but now you speak mainly English and you have maybe relatives who you're translating, or Thai or Vietnamese. A lot of us do a lot of translating in our lives, professionally and casually. From the academic point of view, it means something more than just taking language A and plopping it down. Voila, we have language B. A whole lot more. And let me just point to one verse, which I think anybody who talks about, it's a key passage. I would never teach a class on the Bible or even on Judaism without talking about this passage. It's from a classic example of a book which Jews don't read. I mean, what Jews in the shtetl read Nehemiah? Or what Jews in Arabic lands, the average Jew wouldn't have read Ezra or Nehemiah. But there you go, in Nehemiah 8, you have a prescription of how you make everybody who's gathered, and actually it's right near, it's at Rosh Hashanah, which is Jewish New Year's, which is coming up in Jerusalem. And he said, how do you explain the Bible to people who no longer understand it? They don't understand it for a very good reason, for a couple of very good reasons. One, they're speaking Aramaic. They're no longer speaking Hebrew. And those languages are cognate languages, but they're not the same any more than you would have maybe someone who speaks Spanish be able to understand someone who speaks Italian and vice versa, but those aren't the same languages. Another reason that you need a translation goes to the nature of the Hebrew Bible itself, which I kind of touched on, but I'll now be very direct. The Hebrew Bible is not a book. It's an anthology. It was written over maybe 1,000 years, maybe a few hundred years less than that, but certainly more than 500. So it's an anthology. It contains all sorts of genres, all sorts of periods, and the people who are standing in the Watergate, in front of the Watergate in around 450 BCE, they are as far removed. In fact, they're further removed from some of the earlier poetic material in the Hebrew Bible than we are from the 1611 King James. And if you haven't looked at the 1611 King James lately, let me tell you, it's not an easy go. In other words, a lot of the words you are unfamiliar, and a lot of the words don't mean what they mean anymore. Okay, so by the way, just to because it's so irksome to me, with regard to Ryan Walters, he doesn't really mean the King James Bible of 1611. He means the New Revised Standard Version, because high school students would not be able to understand the 1611 King Bible. By the way, they wanted to use the New International Version, and I think it's Baptist, Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, but the certainly fairly evangelical Protestant owners of Zondervan's Publishing, who own the copyright for NIV, said that. The hell you will. I'm sure they didn't say that, but that was what they meant. It's like, you're not going to turn the Holy Bible over to a bunch of people who may or may not have any idea what it really means. So that's behind the scenes. Okay. Translation, and by the way, how interesting is it that this book, the Bible, has a verse which says, here's how you translate me, right? Or you may need to translate me. I think that's pretty interesting. We talked about source language and target language. I'll just say that this is a fundamental, a simple but fundamental difference. Are you going to pay most attention to the Hebrew and try to replicate that as best you can? Or are you going to pay most attention to the English and try to get the best read you can in English? That's really attention. It's hard to get both. I think Alter does about as well as you can do. So why do we keep retranslating the Bible? I guess from a Jewish point of view, the big story in my book is that the Bible has become, for modern Jewry, one of the primary vehicles of identification, of intellectual engagement. It's something that Jews can still agree to argue about, and can still agree that the study of it is worthwhile. It's still an anchor for modern Jewish communities in a lot of places. So, because you do have to answer the question, why do people keep retranslating this book, when there are adequate translations? Well, Alter has a few reasons, and his primary reason is he thinks most translators up until Robert Alter, and I think he's right, have either been not had a great sense of the Hebrew as a literary language. They know the Hebrew, but they may not have a sense of the beauty of the Hebrew language as it unfolds. And even if they knew Hebrew pretty well, and the King James translators did know Hebrew pretty well, but what they didn't do is ever hear it spoken out loud or used in a prayer service. And so they had a very good sense of the grammatical rules, but they didn't always have a good sense of the cadence or the pitch. So in King James, if you were to read the 1611 King James, you would find that Esau sounds just like Jacob, and David sounds just like Hannah. Everybody sounds like they're an early 17th century English clergy. And that's not good. Well, it's good. It's okay. It's a limitation on the translation. There are some actual errors in the King James Hebrew, but that's to be expected. And remember, if you're going to say the King James Hebrew isn't that great, well, you know what? The 1917 Old Jewish Publication Society, the English isn't so great, because the main translator for the old JPS in 1917, Max Margolis, grew up in Lithuania, came to the US, I forget at what age, maybe a teenager, maybe earlier, but his sense of the beauty of the English language was not great. And it was further hampered by the fact that everybody told him the Bible has to sound like King James if it's going to be in English. So Walter says basically either Hebrew or English has so far suffered. I love both these languages, so let me do it. And he has a couple of other complaints, which I guess I will reverse quickly. One is that Walter says most translators, because it's the Holy Bible. Walter teaches literature out in Berkeley. He's, I don't know what his level of religiosity is, but let's say that his primary commitment is to literary, to being a great literary scholar. And so he says that whenever a translator hits something that isn't clear or isn't sufficiently obvious, previous translators have wanted to explain that verse rather than simply render that verse, translate it straight up. So for him, this is a great heresy, but there are plenty of other sins and heresies in Walter's book. Losing the vowels, just paying no attention to them at all, is a problem, and I agree it is a problem. You can say it has to be and, or like most translators, you can say it can be and, it can be but, it can be so, but you just can't ignore the issue. Missing the pitch, I already talked about that. In a couple of weeks, we'll be reading 1 Samuel 2 in synagogue for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It's Hannah's prayer. It's absolutely exquisite Hebrew. It's absolutely inconceivable that any 11th century peasant, male or female, could have possibly uttered that prayer, right? It's a very high and elevated language. And so there's a missing the pitch. There's the difference between just paying insufficient or no attention to the complexity of English grammar, sentences, clauses, independent clauses, subordinate clauses, semicolons, you name it, we got it. And the simplicity of Hebrew, which basically is one verse in the middle, there's part A, there's part B. If you look at a scholarly Bible, they'll often say Exodus 4:10a, 4:10b. And the second part of that verse usually repeats in other words by extension or contraction or emphasis, the first part of that verse. It's a very simple syntax called parataxis. We've already talked about hearing it. Walter says previous translators haven't paid enough attention to the ear of it. I don't want to, I could go on, but I clearly shouldn't. Here we have some source-focused examples. King James, for all of its deficiencies, is really a great source-focused translation that really does justice to the Hebrew. Everett Fox, I think he's maybe now retired, but up until recently taught at Clark University. He followed the Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig pattern of translating according to the Hebrew. And Walter, he could be in it. He's so good. He could go. And then you have the target focused. In other words, paying a lot of attention to how understandable it is in English. And we have a few examples of that. Okay. We're not going to get to the pilots. But I will go on a few more before opening up for questions. I just want to show you briefly, one piece all in Hebrew. I understand most of you won't. I have my reasons, which I'll explain. And then I want to show you some good, bad, and an ugly. Because after all, that's why you came, right?
Right.
You want to say, how bad can you do it? I'll show you. Okay. Here, I just put this up. This is from Exodus 4:10. It's Moses's last ditch attempt to get off the hook with God. You can guess how that's going to go, and not have to go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go, so that they may go and serve me." This is his last ditch attempt. It doesn't work, of course, and it's a enormously it's a heavy and magnificent scene. I put this up just to show you. This is what it would look like more or less on a scroll. Actually, on a scroll, it would be even harder to read because it would be all smushed together and the word breaks aren't always that great. But Hebrew is a language that is built on consonants. The vowels are detachable, and actually it's the Masoretes, who I mentioned before, who added vowels, who added punctuation, and who added cantillation. In other words, how to chant it. So all of this, if that looks different from that, it's thanks to the Masoretes. And just to, again, this is not a Hebrew lesson, that's for sure. Here's that, I keep referring to this letter, the Vav, which starts so many Hebrew verses, Hebrew Bible verses. And then the only other thing that I would say, here is Devarim, is words or things. I tell my students it's a very small Hebrew vocabulary. You can learn it easily. I don't tell them all about the punctuation. And then so we have words, and that's played back here with here, and then gam, and there's a third gam, which means also, or too, and then there's mitmo, mishil shom, that's from way back when, or yesterday and the day before. It's a common phrase still used in contemporary Hebrew. And then we have this word avdacha, which is eved, which is one of these words in Hebrew that has a huge register from slaves in Egypt all the way to servant of God. That's quite a range of meaning. Okay, and then the last part, which I will attack in these coming translations, it ends. Here's this little mark usually marks the midway point in a Hebrew sentence conceptually, and from here it's ki kavad peh ukvad lashon anochi. Now I'm going to do my own translation. I am heavy of tongue and heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue am I, right? Because you often end the verb subject in Hebrew is often different. Okay, so the truth of the matter is there are modes of really good Bible translations. Most are good, most are highly competent. I just bring these up to show you how different competent translations can really look and sound very different from each other, but they're all competent. This is from Everett Fox, who I mentioned before. He tries to keep the original Hebrew pace, syntax. He breaks it up in breathing spaces. That's all following Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig's dictum. He keeps the Hebrew names in Hebrew, Moshe rather than Moses. When he hits the four-letter name of the Lord, he does Yud. He doesn't. I've seen this done every single way. Lord with a uppercase L. There's no upper and lowercase in Hebrew, by the way. Upper and lowercase L. I've seen it Lord, lowercase Lord. I've seen it Yud Hey Vav Hey. Just keep the Hebrew. I've seen it this way, which would be the anglicized version of Yud Hey Vav Hey. I've seen it Daled, just the four letters. I've seen it so many different ways, but he does it like this. And then he translated because it's Bi Adoni. And then you can see that's not ordinary English, right? No man of words am I. Would you say that? No woman of words am I? I don't think so. But Fox here is trying very much to follow that Hebrew syntax. not from yesterday, not from the day before, not even, and he's doing, this is what King James did with that am and to be's in present tense, instead of italics, which would be confusing because we all think of italics as for a foreign language or an artwork. That's what we use the italics for. He uses square brackets, and your servant, heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue am I. Perfectly good translation. Very source driven, right? NSRV I like very much. I'm not even going to go there. They are still adherent to that King James tradition. And then this is New Jewish Publication Society. The most commonly used still, though I hope not for long. I think it's a little too loose. And you can see how free, how much freer this language flows than that. We don't need to even get into it. You can just see how more freely the language flows. And that's because in the 1960s, the main translators were interested in rendering units of meaning. This is actually in the Mendelssohn tradition. People should understand, or in the Luther tradition, they should understand what they're reading. That should be paramount. Well, I don't know. I don't know if it should be paramount or not, but that's that. And those are, again, most of these Bible translations, very good. But here's what you've been waiting for. The bad ones. Okay. And okay. So this is the this is actually called the Easy to Read Bible. And if you go to Bible Gateway or Blue Letter Bible or any one of these online Bible things, they'll give you it's fun. They have all these different translations. This one, I think, is just atrocious. It's the heresy of explanation. In other words, wherever it's a little difficult, and you know what, parts of the Bible are difficult. It immediately just throws in some extra words of clarification, completely unsupported by any text. I think these are the kind of people who did a translation without knowing any. So here we have, God said, throw your walking stick on the ground. That's mate, one word in Hebrew. And then, so this is sort of like Moses as the guy from the peanut guy from Planters Peanuts, with the walking stick. And then,
I've lost track.
yeah, and then he has, he has the line about, Moses puts his hand in his cloak, and it comes out, and the most common translation in English is leprous. That's how King James 1611 translates it. It's not Hansen's syndrome, it's something else. But what I don't think it is spots as white as snow. Now we have from Mr. Peanut to the snow leopard. Moses is snow leopard. But I think the pièce de résistance comes in that last line, which I showed you a minute ago in Hebrew only. Then Moses said to the Lord, "But Lord, I am telling you, I am not a good speaker. I have never been able to speak well." And that hasn't changed since you started talking to me. I'm still not a good speaker. You will know that I speak slowly and don't use the best words. This, to me, sounds like an angry fifth grader. Peeved at his or her homework assignment. And I think you can fairly say that it completely misses the enormity of this moment at which Moshe, the quintessential prophet and really the hero of the Torah, finally understands he's not getting out of it. He's going to have to confront the king god of Egypt and ask for his people's freedom. It's a very heavy moment. And this is, boy, does that miss the mark. But if that's bad, for ugly, it can't compete with this. Now, I should say, some of my friends are Orthodox Jewish. Some of my best friends. And I mean that, really, that's true. And they would all be appalled at this translation, as I am. This commits a heresy that I don't think Alter even dreamed of, is that you would simply translate by transliterating rather than actually translating. So if you take a quick look at this, you have mate, nachash, yad, take, basar, hine, all words. Oops, I'm sorry. Oh yeah, no, you're right. All words that are that's not an English word. Neither is that. And and when you get phrases like a yad, now I'll tell you yad. Here's the issue. A lot of Hebrew words have many layers of meaning. So a yad can be a finger, it can be a hand, it's often with an outstretched hand, it can even mean a remembrance. Okay, so yad does have a lot of range of meanings, but it cannot be an adequate solution to just transliterate it when you're doing a translation. And you get, again, good, bad, and ugly. And he put his take, yad, into his take. I mean, I don't know what that is. But it's not good English, it's not good translation. And I guess finally we get to again, this is that Hebrew I showed you before. This is the last line here. I understand the four-letter word, the four-letter word of God here, Hashem, just the name, very fine. It actually, I think that has some pluses here, because then you don't have to say Adonai, Adonai, which would be the way you would say it. But for one check mark plus, here come the minuses. I am not an ish devarim. Again, that's not English. I am not a man of words, but ish devarim is not English, neither heretofore. Now, 2:4 worked in 1611 for the King James. It does not work in the 20th century, or I know we're in the 21st century, but so maybe 21st century. Translation, that's just, all of a sudden we're going from gobbledygook transliteration to legalese, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy Eved. Okay, pseudo King Jamesian, and again, or just afraid to translate Eved, but here I think it's clear that the servant works perfectly well. I know Eved could mean other things, but you have to take but I am slow of speech and of slow lashon. Okay, I understand you don't want to go kaved peva kaved lashon, but that's just a ghastly translation. I think you'd all agree. Okay, I didn't quite get to the pilot page of what. Does someone have an accurate watch on? That's all. Yeah, no more than. This is just to look at it yourself. You'll see it's pretty interesting how different they are. This is the Gunther Plaut 1981 Reformed Torah Commentary. Flip the page and you'll get the still to be published new Reform Torah Commentary. I really think it's great. I think it's great not just because I'm involved with the project, but I love the Hebrew font. I love the way it's laid out. Very Gruber Rosenzweig. I like the fact that it's harkening back to an era when the commentary hears the page with the text. I like the fact that it opens right to left as Hebrew does, not left to right as Plaut did. I like just about everything about it. And I like the fact, once I got over the shock of it, of having contemporaries and people younger than I am, which is really a heresy, represented in the chidushim, the novelties or new insight section, including not just youngsters, but actually non-rabbinic professionals, which I think is great. So when it comes to the building in New York, they had a Jewish architect contribute. And when it came to the appurtenances of the high priest, they had a Jewish fabric designer weigh in. And I think it really adds a lot to the commentary once they got over the novelty of it. Okay, I'm sorry I didn't leave more time for questions, but